Hello and welcome to a job walkthrough. This is for the Query Simple List Mode job. I should say right off the bat, this is a very involved and, to be perfectly honest, complex job. There's a lot going on here, and this is a very advanced method that we're using here. Essentially, we are creating form field elements dynamically, and then we are writing elements to a database based on those dynamic form field elements. Most of the time, this will not be something that you need to do. Most of the elements that you create can simply be created using the editor, and that is that. However, for those times where we want to create dynamic elements, though, this is an incredibly powerful technique. So first, let's take a look at the database. The database itself consists of 3 tables. The first is a list of products. We're paying special attention to the product title column right here, where I have the name of 3 sample products. The second table is sales, and this table is incredibly simple. It's simply going to have a unique ID, which is, in this case, our primary key, and then we would insert in a real job a user ID that would tie this sale to a user in our system. Finally, when I write to the sales table, I'm going to grab this value, this primary key right here, and then use that as an index to say, here is the sale ID of what I just sold, and then here's the product ID of the item that the user just bought. So 3 tables. Let's take a look at this form as it runs and see what that input looks like. So I run my form. I get my 3 products here. I'll select the first and last, and I'll hit submit. If we go to our database and refresh it now, starting with our sales table, you can see here now that I have a value of 3 that got inserted into the database. This value of 3 then is used in our second insert, which for our sales items right here means that for this particular sale with an ID of 3, I had 2 products, product 1 and product 3. As we can see, product 1 and product 3 are indeed the 2 items that I selected. So let's take a look at the job itself and see how it works. The first item then is this query module is where we're actually creating our form field elements. There's nothing too special going on here, though it is really important to note that we always have a primary key field selected. So this ID field is in fact the primary key of the products table, right? So if I go to products, this is the primary key. We use this primary key, as you recall 1 and 3, in the sales item to say here's which products I sold. Now, that's not to say that you need to use a primary key for this, but it'd be an incredibly poorly designed database if we didn't use a numeric value like this to identify which product that we had. So we're selecting ID and product title from products. Here's where the real magic happens. So if we scroll down to create dynamic form elements, you'll notice that I've checked this element right here, and I've set the dynamic element creation mode to simple list mode. Now this is incredibly important because this is where most of the magic for the form creation happens. We do have 2 modes right here, meta-based and simple list mode, but simple list mode is the one that we want for this particular job. So now that we're creating the form field elements, it is time to submit the page and actually tell the database which items the user selected. We do that in 3 separate steps. The first step is that we're going to insert into sales a null value, and then we set our last insert ID to checked so that I get a value called retval back, which is going to have my primary key. I know there's a lot of things I just said right there, but this technique of inserting into a database and getting a primary key back is incredibly common, right? The database is where we hold our unique IDs. We often have to get that ID back, and that's what this guy does right here. What it says is when you insert into this database, because this is a primary auto increment field right here, it's going to have one higher number than the previous one when I insert into it. So for example, when I insert next time, it's going to get a 4. I want to get that number 4 back because same as we insert in a sales item using that sales ID, the next time I submit this form, I want to grab the next highest ID and use that as my sales ID for this particular insert. And so that's what this does. Set last insert ID is going to set itself equal to a PHP variable called retval. The next thing that we do then is a little bit tricky. The first is the actual query module where we're inserting into the sales items table. The insert statement itself is actually pretty simple. We're inserting into sales items, sales ID, and product ID. Now, as you may guess, sale ID, remember, was this primary key field right here. So sale ID is once again coming from this retval value right here. Now, if you're not familiar with RackForms tokens, now would definitely be a good time to brush up on that. Well, the basic idea is this $ and the 2 braces is how we grab a PHP variable from the system. And we're going to see 1 or 2 more tokens before this demonstration is over. We have a second token right here because it uses the $. As you can see from our tooltip, we know it's a PHP variable, and it's called product ID. Now here's where the trickiness happens. Now this makes sense that we insert the product ID because again, here's the two products that we have, but how do we actually get that product ID? When we use the query module, as we've done right here, to create dynamic form elements, in doing so, RackForms automatically saves to a form field element called FB dynamic elements. If we want to access at any time after that page has been submitted which form fields are dynamically created, that is their names, not their value, just their name, we use the FR token right here. So FR token, FB dynamic elements, is simply going to be a name of all the elements that the user has selected and that the system has created. Now using this FB dynamic elements token right here, we actually get to this guy. So right here we have a little bit of text, so we just have a standard text element. It says thank you for your submission. But then we have a block of PHP code underneath it, which is doing something incredibly important for us. It's basically using this FB dynamic elements, that's what was created here, in a for each statement. Now this FR, if you haven't seen it before, stands for field raw. That is when RackForms builds this form, it's going to take the raw value of this variable right here. In this case, it's going to be the name of the form field elements that we have. It's an array. And because we're using a for each on it, it simply means that every time that we created a dynamic form element in here, it's going to pass it to this loop right here. This loop then checks to make sure that that element is not set to null. Now this is a little bit tricky right here. We're using the FR token to grab the dynamic value right here, but I'm actually checking a session variable called the name of that element. And that's because whenever RackForms saves a form field element, it creates a session variable named the field name, and then it puts a value inside of that. And so by using $F right here in this token format, we've essentially said, for every one of those dynamic form elements, go ahead and check to make sure a value was set. If one was set, then we're going to insert sales item. And then we pass retval and the session, once again, form field value. Now here's where the second bit of magic happens. So this insert sales item, where is this actually coming from, or what does this do? Well, insert sales item is the name of a function, and it's actually coming from this query module right here. One of the really incredible features of RackForms query modules is that we can take all this database goodness and we can actually wrap it into a PHP function. The reason why we do that is exactly why we're using it right here. In other words, I have a multiple number of rows that I need to insert into the database. Now by default, a query or SQL Plus module doesn't actually handle that, right? It just inserts one thing and then it's done. However, if I were to create a function out of my query module, as I've done right here, well then I can actually call this function as many times as I need to insert as many rows as I possibly need. And so that's exactly what we're doing right here. Under function call definition, I've said insert sales item, and then I'm passing the retval, again that comes from this guy, and then the product ID. Now, of course, this is just an argument. Product ID hasn't been set yet. Where it's actually being set is when we call the function, which again, we do right here. So insert sales item, we pass in the retval, and again, here is where we actually pass that value. The end result then is when I call this function, it's going to take the retval, that is whatever this value was right here. It's then going to take the form field element using this token right here, and whatever that value happens to be is going to be put into product ID right here. So there's a lot going on here. The biggest idea is one of these days we will probably make this a little bit simpler in terms of functionality. We'll wrap some more automation around this. But for right now, this is an incredibly powerful technique that we have at our disposal. If you ever have any questions about this, of course, just let me know. I'll be more than happy to give you a hand. And so that is our job walkthrough. Any questions, as always, again, info@rackforms.com, or you can call the number at the top of the site. Thanks much.